Zeitgeist, meaning spirit or mood of the time, is the film of the time. Produced as a personal creative project, it was made available on the internet and quickly became a global phenomenon. Its comprehensive coverage of the facts behind religion, 911 and the finance system caused such an explosion in popularity that Google's video counters reached their limits at 50 million views. In October 2008, the second film, Zeitgeist Addendum, was released, covering the banking system, its negative effects on humanity, and designs for an alternative, new and improved future. Peter Joseph, director of Zeitgeist and Zeitgeist Addendum, talks with us about his reasons and inspirations for creating both films and his hopes for the future of humankind.
Religion was always very interesting to me ever since I was a child. I was never raised in a really rigid religious environment, but I was around it to a certain degree. My families were very Catholic. You know, my parents were not particularly religious,
Yes,
but
I was raised as Catholic also.
Right. And I went to a Catholic school for a little while, so I got to experience this. And as a child, there was always something strange to me. Like, in one class, I'd be in science, and then in one class, I'd go to this little church situation. And even at a young age, there was a strange dichotomy to me that didn't make any sense. And not to say that all religions are, don't have a value. They actually all very much do historically. And there are a lot of people that see the film, they get the wrong impression about what I'm trying to say about religion. In the first film, I deal with the history of religion. That's sort of a history that no one really talks about because it's not the established representation. Right.
I must admit, when I first watched that myself, I was absolutely flabbergasted when you show how the Christ religion and how many others came in under very, very similar situations, and that absolutely knocked my socks off because I never knew anything like that.
Yeah, the dying and resurrecting God-man.
That's right.
Has been going on for millennia, for ages, and it's a symbolic rebirth, as early pagan ideology. It's where you're born again. All these
goes right to the Druidism and the Solar Cross.
Oh, absolutely.
The birth of the sun.
It's age old, exactly, and it has multiple symbolisms apart from the sun as being its core. Like astrotheology is the terminology used to describe this stellar and solar element that has basically been transmuted and transformed into the historical religions that we think these attributes are actual history. When if you look far enough back, you see that it's basically pure allegory. And that even though there were certain characters that emerged historically, say in Christianity, there probably was somebody that fulfilled some role that this Christ character was assumed. But by the time the Bible came to fruition, the Christ character was transformed into a totally mythological figure.
I guess you must have miffed off a lot of Christians when you put this out there.
And they misinterpret, I believe, because even if he didn't exist, it doesn't matter. It's the message.
It's the message. It is the message, yes.
They shouldn't be... I don't believe... Religion has a propensity towards materialism. They don't call it materialism, but they hold on to something, and they really can't break away from it. And that's the definition of materialism in my mind. So to think that, just because this character didn't exist, this demeans the whole thing is not necessarily the case. If you want to drive for pure superstition, then yes, it is the case, which of course I don't advocate. I think philosophy is much more important than, obviously philosophy. Superstition is a derogatory sort of term, but when it comes to these notions of the man dying for your sins, I think these are misconstrued. I think there's no real relevance to it, and it's based on this sort of control mechanism that you're guilty the moment you're born, and he died for your sins thousands of years. Yes, it's distorted on one side, and then there's also kernels of truth that speak to the human condition. Love the neighbor.
So everything kind of gets mixed up together.
It does, and it's to speak a little bit more about that. The Christ character is very much composite because there's a lot of dichotomy in his rhetoric. In one passage he says, I don't bring peace, I bring the sword. I want to have, your neighbor against neighbor. And then another passage is love thy neighbor and love your enemies, So
it's a bit of a mixed message, isn't it, really?
Well, because it's a composite text, and that makes sense. You find these dichotomies, these yin and yangs happening all through lots of different God-men that have existed. So that's why it's even more proof. I think the sadness to me is that most religions are arrogant and they don't realize that they're interconnected. And I think if they realized they were interconnected, then there wouldn't be so much dispute. I mean, the problem with religious texts in general is that they're semantically interpreted. Christianity alone has about 34,000 different subgroups, and they are slightly at odds with each other. The Seventh-day Adventists, they all have these tiny little variations of their interpretation. I believe that's very dichotomous, and in the end, my major argument towards religion is that it's completely divisive of humanity. So it's not progressive. It has kernels of truth, but I think it's time most move beyond these dogmas and these faiths that really tend to separate humanity, because nothing's going to come positive out from that. I think through time, and that's why I've made the films that I do, I talk about the topics that I do, people will realize that this infighting, and I think it slightly comes from the restrictions of our language, because in order for me to describe something to you, I have to separate things into words. This is a table, this is a glass. So division is inherent in our cognitive awareness, but we haven't reached a spiritual awareness enough to know that even though this is a glass, it's still made of the same thing as this table, and the fact that it's separate from this table is actually quite suspect. It just looks that way because of our five-sense reality. Molecularly, when you get into quantum mechanics and high levels of science, it's more of like a sea of molecules. There's different things that happen over time spans that are so vast that we can't really recognize, so we don't see them. Like if I have my hand on here long enough, it's going to make an imprint on this table through the chemicals that will emerge and come together. So there's no separation. It's an illusion.
I feel like, I don't know if you feel like this, that sometimes we are just being tuned in on a frequency just so all we see is what certain bodies want us to see.
Well, sure. That, I think you could say the mass media does that on a daily basis.
Yeah.
So, they've created this illusion of terrorism.
Exactly.
Which is statistically irrelevant. As far as the odds of any of us dying in a terrorist act are virtually zero. But yet, you turn on the television, and that seems to be a very common topic continuously. And then they change, the language. So now the war in, say, Iraq is no longer a war against insurgents, it's a war against terrorism.
Yeah.
So then you have this nonsense that's perpetually built upon. And they did the same thing, with communism. They did the same. They just need these enemies, for that example. But the media tells us what to think, and it creates a state of mind, and we tend to absorb that and create an identity with it, and then we end up projecting it.
Yeah.
Coming to the new film, one of the things that I talk about is the free market system, or what I call more generally the monetaryism as a general distinction, which is more of an invented word, where all societies, doesn't matter what they are, if they're communist or socialist or even fascist or free market, capitalist, they all have the same type of competitive structure inherently, because it's still exists. We all exist within scarcity. So there's a taking mechanism that comes naturally in the environment. I don't say naturally because that's the way we are. No difference between someone who is a cat burglar needing to survive because they come from scarcity, or more specifically saying, where I come from, like South Central Los Angeles, there's no jobs, everyone sells drugs, they're addicted to drugs because they're upset, because they're in this hard environment of poverty. So they do what they have to do to survive. There's no difference between that type of criminal behavior and then, say, the high corporate elite that chooses to invade a country to take its resources and take it over and create, all the elements that it wants for its own personal gain. It's the same mechanism, and I think that's something that hasn't been realized, and it's the environment that's to blame for all of this. Granted, survival is inherent; it's a genetic basis that we want to live, but how we conduct our living is based on what we've been taught. I think the conscious awakening has to occur when people realize that it's giving and not taking that is the key. So in a new society, which is what I advocate in the new film, the shift would have to be that people realize that their integrity is only as good as the integrity of everything else around them. For example, if I'm walking down the street and I see a homeless person, I know that through time that there might be a propensity for that homeless person to commit crime because they have to survive. They might have to rob people, they might have to do what they have to do. And when pushed in a corner, like an animal, in fear, they're going to do what they have to do to survive.